I myself worked in state government for my first 5 years after engineering school as a field engineer before coming to DC. So I really believe in the importance of state and local government, and I'm also part of a project trying to establish state science technology policy fellowship programs, and I do a lot of state and local based analysis. So I'm not just an academic, I really am on the front lines of this. Right now, I'm finishing up an analysis that is looking at the challenges that people with chronic diseases face in West Virginia and getting to medical care. So I've been working on this project for the past year, and it should be done sometime the next week or two. It's going to be done by the end of the year. So it's a topic. Equity analysis is very much an emerging field. So like equity itself has been around for a long time, like decades, as part of policy analysis. But it's only really been in recent years, in the past 10 or 15 years, that it's sort of gone out to sort of the broader community, and we're really seeing a lot of activity. And so that's why I put together this class, was to uh, try to kind of really operationalize equity analysis. So it's just not something, or what I call puff, where you say, oh, yes, it's fair to everybody, but we really have some analysis behind it, and we can measure progress to see how well we are doing in terms of reaching our goals. So after this, you should have a good definition or understanding of equity definitions, equity analysis, looking at past, present, or future programs. And thanks everybody who talked about what kind of analysis they were looking at, because it does include all these things. Sometimes we're looking at the past as a program evaluation to see, is implementation of the program equitable? Sometimes we're designing programs for the future. So we're trying to figure out how to have equity as a key principle in design of future programs. And sometimes just an issue comes up. And then all of a sudden people want to say, oh, okay, is this fair? Is this not fair? And so forth. A key element of equity analysis, which is even more important today, again, than it was, say, a decade ago, is community engagement. And this is something that's important to do throughout your process. I'm going to talk about some of the tools that we have available for equity analysis, and also some of the challenges and possible solutions when you face equity analysis, which is can be a challenging space. So I just wanted to do some case studies to give you some illustrations why equity analysis is important. This is a map from Chicago, and you can see here that the disparity there is in flooding in different parts of Chicago, and how it affects like people of color, people who are elderly, children, people below the poverty line, all sorts of different factors. Here's another example. This is in Denver, and this is analysis looking at parks. This is becoming more of an issue because, and I found out when I first learned about this, which was only because the American Association for the Advancement of Science meeting was in Denver about a year ago. And when I was looking to say, oh, what's happening in this, I found out this is a problem all over the United States. So what happens is that, back in the day, that the nice parks, the green parks that we think about, went into the white neighborhoods, and then the Black neighborhoods typically got very limited green space, like maybe a basketball court or something like that, a blacktop space. And because of climate change, parks are really an important part of providing shade and other actions that kind of help cool the heat island effect. So this is an interesting analysis that talks about it, and I'm going to talk about how Denver has responded to those challenges, and I think set a good model for other communities that are really interested in doing an equity analysis. And you can see here this Blueprint Denver, that is the name of the program. And you'll see that that the racial composition of Denver has changed over time. And the concern is that, as people go in and out of urban areas like Denver, is that sometimes it becomes too costly and it's difficult for people to live in the same communities that they always have. And this is, part of this concern about displacement issues uh, due to changing demographics in neighborhoods. This is another one, and this talks about the challenges that we have on the health front, where people in rural and urban areas uh, don't have the same health uh, as they do in other areas. In other words, you're more likely to die earlier if you're in a rural area than in an urban area, and you're more likely to have certain of the top 10 diseases as well if you're in a rural area. So I'm going to talk about the sort of 12-step process uh, to go through this. I will mention also at this point that you will get copies of these slides. So don't feel you have to frantically copy things down or things of that nature. So I've adapted this 12-step process after kind of looking at a number of different models and then real world application over time. So it's sort of a mix of different things that I've now put together. So the first part in equity analysis is sort of what I'm calling the sort of prep for the analysis. And the first thing, and we're going to go through each one of these, but I just want to give you an overview. We're going to talk about creating this sort of brave and safe place, looking at kind of the equity perspectives in your geographic area, the what step in the policy process, that's the focus of your analysis, the need, if at all possible, to establish an advisory committee of stakeholders, and defining, I guess I've kind of got two defines there, but basically thinking about how your organization defines equity, or you're going to need to develop a definition of equity. The second part is to actually do the equity analysis. So there are a couple of methods, and I'm going to show you the ones that you can follow if you'd like. And then working with the advisor committee to get agreement on things like equity principles for the community challenges, developing a community engagement strategy, and then gathering and analyzing data. Then the last part is something that some of you will do and others of you will not do. When I worked for the Congressional Research Service, which is a think tank for Congress, we were allowed to identify policy options, but we were not allowed to make recommendations. Depending on your position, you may not be in that situation where maybe they just want the analysis, they don't want policy options. Sometimes they want options, but not recommendations. But if you are at the stage where whomever you're preparing your analysis is interested in recommendations, or you don't have an organization oversight that says you can't make recommendations, then you want to go through these last three steps, which is looking at conducting a systems analysis, looking at the root causes of the inequities, conducting an impact assessment for all the policies and decision-making, and that needs to also be part of your community engagement strategy. And then doing continuous evaluation on the effectiveness and adapting, modifying the strategies in response to community engagement. So with that, I'm going to start with this first step. Now, the reason this is something I've added over the past year or so, and that is because every once in a while, not very often, I have a challenging discussion where somebody, when we're discussing some of these sensitive issues in equity, is triggered, in which case I say, just leave the discussion and go someplace else and come back when you want. Sometimes it's people who are very sensitive about certain issues. And so I have found over time, it's good to create what in this world is called a brave and safe space. And so this is something we want to consider initially for our equity analysis team, but as you'll see as we go on, for our advisor committees and all public engagement activities. Now, the one I selected is from the University of Wisconsin Extension Service. I use a lot of their materials, like in logic models and things of that nature. And this was developed, as you'll see, as part of a 4-H extension activity. But I thought they did a good job in doing something that could be used in all sorts of situations. And so people talk about brave space, and brave space means that people need to feel that they can be brave enough to say what it is that they want to say. And that means being very curious, trying to understand viewpoints, and that maybe people haven't heard before, ask a lot of questions, acknowledge the opinions and emotions of others in the room, because that can be quite intense at sometimes. And then using I statements by speaking from your own perspective and not from the perspective of others. And in the challenging discussion that I had about a year ago, which was actually, with a group of scientists and engineers, this was a really sensitive point where people who were from the underrepresented groups resented the people who were from the majority groups speaking like on their behalf. And that's where this comes from. And the other thing is basically understanding that science is okay, honoring your truths, but really wanting to understand people's lived experiences. Now, the safe space is focused on listening to understand. Step up, step back means that, if you're somebody who's a talker, I tend to be a talker. I tend to ask lots of questions, recognizing you have to step back, speaking with good intention. Sometimes there'll be a need for confidentiality, and having this sort of non-judgmental space where everyone has a unique relationship on the issue. Again, this goes back to this kind of concept of lived experience, and what is shared stays here. So I think that, to me, one of the bottom lines is we want to assume that the people with whom we're engaging have good intentions, and not assume like negativity, or really try to steer people to having a good, positive discussion. So the second step is looking at where you are in your policy process. So this is a policy life cycle. And some of you are going to be, depending on where your activities are, you might be formulating policy, you might be adopting a policy. In other words, maybe it's been some sort of legislative authority has said, okay, here's a policy, you guys go implement it. But they don't give much guidance, so you have to really be in charge of thinking about it. Looking at the evaluation of the policy, sometimes it's just maintaining the policy, just kind of checking it each year to make sure that it's staying on track, meeting your goals, and it's equitable. So why don't anybody sort of type in chat where you think you might be in this process as I grab a drink. Okay, so the next thing is defining how your organization defines equity, or you might need to develop a definition of equity. So this is a definition of equity that I have in my book, and which I've used for like many years. And it's basically the fairness of the policy. For every policy, there are going to be winners, there's going to be losers, and you're always trying to balance these things. And then in policy overall, equity is just one factor. You have these other of these 4 E's, as I talk about. The other ones are effectiveness, like the degree to which the policy will achieve its goal; efficiency, which is getting the best policy impact for the societal buck; and then ease of political acceptability. And by that, I don't mean politics, but I mean the degree to which there is support or opposition for the policy. So all four of these are the main key factors that influence policy. So here, when we talk about equity, it's really the fairness and understanding the winners and losers. And sometimes you might say modify the policy so that the people who are the losers feel that they are supported, for example. Now, here's some definitions from some other sources. So the Anna E. Casey Foundation, I use a lot of their work, and actually from a lot of different foundations. They are really doing some very good work on equity. It's a state quality or ideal of being just, impartial, and fair that needs to be thought through as a structural and systemic concept. Then we have the American Evaluation Association, which is the condition of fair and just opportunities for all people to participate and thrive in society, regardless of individual or group identities or difference. And then the academic definition, when this goes back, a very long time to a major scholar in this area. And this is the extent to which a policy's benefits and costs are spread among those affected in such a way that no group or individual receives less than a minimum benefit level or a maximum cost level. So what's important to think about is that your organization might have a definition of equity, or your state, your local government. But if not, then there needs to sort of be a definition. Now, one thing, I don't know why that happened. One thing that can get very confusing, particularly sort of in the rhetoric, is diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice. So what happens is that people, when they talk about DEI activities or DEIJ, or sometimes it's called JEDI, they mean all of these things. And typically it is in a context of sort of like an underrepresented group of some kind. It doesn't necessarily mean people of color. It could be people who have disabilities. It could be all sorts of different kinds of things. But in equity, in an academic sense, means fairness. That could be something like, like ranchers and wolf protection, right? But because DEI has such political connotations, it's when people say equity, they might think that you're meaning all of these, when you might just be meaning equity on its own. And that is sort of a challenge that we face in these discussions, and why it's also very important that everybody agree on what we mean by equity in this particular policy situation. So I'm going to play this short video. This is from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, and it's talking about the difference between equality and equity.
These days, we hear a lot of people using the word equity, but what does it really mean? It's not quite the same as equality, which means everybody gets treated the same. Equity is about fairness. It means that everybody gets what they need based on their own situation, because we're not all the same. The difference between equality and equity is important. It's part of the reason the United States spends more on healthcare per person than any other advanced nation and has much poorer health. It's important to remember that a person's health depends on many factors, things like their environment, schools, and workplaces, to name a few. We call these social determinants of health, like clean drinking water for children and easy access to fresh food. We can follow the lead of communities like Columbia Gorge in Washington and Oregon, where businesses, doctors, and farmers tackled the local hunger problem with the Veggie RX voucher program. And the New Jersey Partnership for Healthy Kids is bringing down high rates of obesity in underserved communities. We should be inspired by these local efforts and remember that health equity is all about making things better for all of us. When everyone's healthy, everyone benefits.
Okay.
These.
So the next step is to gain an understanding of equity perspectives in your geographic area. So this is a very important executive order that was issued on the first day of the Biden administration. And it basically gives a definition of equity. So you'll see here that equity means the consistent and systematic, fair, just, and impartial treatment of all individuals, including individuals who belong to underserved communities, which I'll talk about in a second, that have denied such treatment. And it gives like a whole list of people. So this is, as far as I'm aware, sort of the only real formal definition at the federal government level of equity. And when we go down here to what it means is that when we're looking at underserved communities, it's important to understand that it's both individuals and communities. In other words, it might not just be a geographic community, like a city, but it could also be people who are from, say, one of those groups of one kind or another. And I have no idea why this red stuff is appearing. So that's important to consider for, might be, say, like people of like First Nations and things like that, that even though they don't live in the same geographic area, but they might also all be affected by a certain policy. So the question is what's going to happen in the Trump administration? So although Trump has indicated that Project 2025 is not something that he does. This is from the Heritage Foundation. It does have things that might impact federal programs and then subsequently state programs that get federal money. For example, it talks about eliminating all federal DEI offices. I know I was just at the National Science Foundation last week, and some of their programs are going to be of concern that focus on equity and STEM. There's federal contractor equity mandates. There might be some penalized organizations for racial quotas. There's something called the disparate impact liability. And this is related to companies, where it takes away sort of their ability to challenge. So we don't quite know what's going to happen, but these are some of the kind of issues that are concerned. But on the other hand, and this is something that we found out from the, from Trump 1, as we sort of begin to call it, is that sometimes these programs are supported by red states. For example, digital equity. Like I do a lot of work in I'm based in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, but I do a lot of work in West Virginia. This is a really, really big issue for West Virginia. And I remember back when there was some concern about getting rid of some of the subsidies for wind turbines. But, the whole Midwest gets a lot of economic value from wind turbines. And so as a result, that legislation was supported and is still around today. But, there are some things. Senator Ted Cruz from Texas, he is trying to kill some of these things. FCC is trying to kill these things. So what that means is that we don't know what's going to happen in the equity space. And so my advice is that, I'm going to show you some resources and things here. If there's any that are on a federal website, I would encourage you to download those and use those as soon as you possibly can before January 20th, because we just don't know if they're going to be there after January 20th. So the next thing is establishing an advisory committee of stakeholders to guide your analysis. And this is something that, I've done through all the different kinds of activities. Like I said, I was talking about health, but the study I did before this was on carbon dioxide reduction. Before that was on water kind of issues. I've done things on energy issues. And having an advisor committee of stakeholders that you can engage with as you do the analysis from the very beginning can be really important in terms of the, its credibility. So who are stakeholders? This is from a very useful document from how the Housing Urban Development. They have a big community engagement toolkit there. And it's an example of something I would encourage you to download, while it's still available. And you'll see here that, they have all sorts of different folks here. They have residents, faith groups, nonprofits, business owners, institutions, government, philanthropists, media. These are kind of examples of, where you want to try to identify people. The other thing I've had people do often is to go to ChatGPT and say, hey, who are the community stakeholders in West Virginia on rural healthcare? And it amazingly generates a very good list. And, some organizations that the students that I work with have not found. So I think it's really good to make sure there's a lot of small pocket kinds of organizations that don't necessarily get much visibility, but who really, sort of care about these issues. So the one thing to really think about is who might be part of that advisory committee. So how do you find these people? So you try to start in your preliminary research as you're establishing the committee, look to see what's out there already. There might be some sort of community website. Like in West Virginia, there's a West Virginia Rural Health Association. So you can sort of see who's been active there, who the speakers are at their meetings, those kinds of things. Obviously, there's traditional news, but as that has been replaced more by blogs, things will happen there. Sometimes there's surveys that have been done in the past on the issue. There might have been forums or dialogues. So start looking for specific people. And then what I always do is when I ask somebody to say, tell them what I'm doing, I'll be part of the advisory committee, I say, well, who else has been active in this area? And they'll know who they've been on panels and discussions with, even people who oppose their point of view. And that's always, really helpful to do. So the next thing is looking at a standard equity analysis process that's appropriate for you. So there's two that I think make sense. Now, most of these, as you'll see here, they're going to talk about racial equity, and that is because most of them were developed after George Floyd, and that happened around 2014, 15, around that sort of area. But there's no reason it can't be used for all kinds of equity, not just racial equity. And even when you look at this thing, you'll see that if you take out the word racial, they all still make sense. But of course, if you are doing racial equity, it's certainly fine to include it. But this one is from the Government Alliance on Race and Equity. And it's a more formal one. And I've tried it, and for me, it doesn't work, but I've in teaching this over time, I know that some organizations really do like this method. I actually prefer this one. This is from the Annie E. Casey Foundation. I think it's a little bit easier to understand, and this is the one I'll be using throughout the kind of analysis portion of this part of the presentation. And we'll go through each of these steps. But basically, you start with establishing race equity inclusion principles, engaging populations, gathering, analyzing data, doing systems analysis, and so forth. All these sort of things that I talked about earlier. So what you want to do is you want to work with the advisory committee that you've established to get an understanding of equity principles for whatever the community challenge is, and also have them look at your plan of action to see if it makes sense. So say you might say that you're going to engage a certain population and say, oh, well, when you do that, there's this whole meeting that occurs every month that you never even heard of. where all the people are there, and this is a great time for you to engage people. So this might be what you would do in an advisory committee discussion. You talk about the actual societal challenge. You agree upon a definition of equity, and then you want to apply that equity definition to whatever the societal challenge is. Talk about the root causes, have prepared for the discussion, a list of stakeholders, interested parties, and then have them look at your equity analysis plan of action. So in my case, in the study I was just talking about, we had the health community who was focused on sort of patient care, things like that. And we had the transportation community who was more like on public transit. And there's also the community of people, the commercial providers. And so it was part of the benefit that came out of this study was bringing those communities together. And one thing that the transportation people have told me is that they had no idea of the challenges people with chronic diseases in West Virginia faced in getting to their medical appointments. And just that dialogue itself, by bringing people together, that convening function is a benefit of the equity analysis itself. Okay, so then what you want to do is develop and implement a community engagement strategy, incorporating the feedback that you received. So this is an inclusive engagement kit. It's actually from the UK. This, by the way, is all very much of an international kind of issue. And the first part is understanding the area, like in this case, if you're focusing on a geographic region, the people, the affected communities, the stakeholder, any barriers that need to be overcome, and during that process. For example, one thing which is more common these days is like you don't want to necessarily hold your sort of engagement activities during a Monday through Friday, 9 to 5 day. Sometimes you're going to actually pay people to attend your events. Like one time I was doing a study here in Pittsburgh with people who are unemployed, to ask them about manufacturing jobs. And we gave them all free food. And then we also gave them like $20 gift cards to our local grocery chain. So you probably going to need to create incentives for stakeholders to participate in these activities. Then what you want to do is you want to co-design whatever it is you're doing. So when you're talking about, for example, some sort of data collection or analysis, you're not coming in there and presenting it to them. You're working with them as to what should be part of the data you're collecting and how you are collecting that data. So they are part of the process, not just you just delivering, like a presentation and he says, that sound okay to you? And they say, oh yeah, that sounds okay. It's more of a dialogue, a two-way engagement. And I have found, I've done this now several times with the faculty at West Virginia University. And I say, okay, well, here it is. When you're on these stakeholder engagements, I want you to listen and not talk. And amazingly, they do. And every time we come out with really interesting insights that really changed the perception of the faculty who were there and really help the local population have less of this kind of ivory tower kind of concern, because they really felt like what they were saying was going to have action. So you want to record the presentation, measure your success criteria, adapt your approach because you want to get feedback on how that sort of dialogue and so forth is going. And then this is sort of a continuous conversation. So here is a diagram. This is, again, from HUD, looking at the life cycle of community engagement. And it's going from initial planning to plan development, finalization, evaluation, implementation, and the actual launch. So here is something like I put together, but thinking about elderly population, thinking about telehealth in rural areas. So your initial planning, you might be conducting surveys or focus groups to sort of understand, the elderly needs and barriers. Like in West Virginia, it's lack of access to broadband, plus just general literacy. Some don't have mobile phones. Some, uh, uh, you know, have challenges even seeing things, so that things that are visual are very challenging for them. Then, and sort of developing your plan, then you want to kind of bring in other stakeholders, like healthcare providers, for example, or maybe those from senior centers that are in the community, so you can align those with services with community needs. Uh, then you would say pilot the telehealth system with a small group for feedback, host a community events with in-person demonstrations, have a dedicated helpline for elderly telehealth users, and then gather feedback. And this would sort of be a continuous loop because once you get the feedback at the end, something's not going to work well for one reason or another, and then you're going to go through the whole process again for any modifications that you make. So the next step is gathering and analyzing data. So basically, you're collecting the data, analyzing it, and then you're identifying both demographic and non-demographic disparities based on lived experiences. So one thing that often happens to us as analysts, and particularly like somebody like myself, is I'm going into West Virginia. I've never lived in West Virginia. Um, the faculty often at, say, the university that I work with, they are not native West Virginians. And so they don't understand the history and the culture and things that have affected people's beliefs over the long term of West Virginia, history. For example, one is that, the, you know, West Virginia itself is a poor state. Why is it a poor state? Because it had all these riches of coal. It's because all the money went to people in New York. And as a result, for some West Virginians, there is resentment now today for people coming from California and wanting to get carbon credits from the forests that are in West Virginia. And so there's some of the population who's concerned about somebody from another state coming in and trying to manage the resources of West Virginia. And that is a non-demographic disparity, right? It's a non-demographic challenge related to the culture and interactions of the people who were involved. So this is going back to this blueprint Denver, which again is to me the most impressive of the equity analysis that I have seen. And what I like about this is all the different things they did for community engagement. So like you'll see here, this intercept event. So rather than relying on people to come to the planning team, the team went to block parties, neighborhood organization meetings, district meetings, community celebrations. So they attended like 35 events over the course of this time period, which I think was about a year. Um, they also had community workshops. They had this plan van. So they went out with like a mobile billboard and provided information. They even developed a game called Growing a Better Denver. Um, they had community task forces, they had online stuff, they had engagement kiosks so that they could have them in all sorts of different locations where people could have input. And so I thought this was very impressive, all the things that they thought of to engage their community. And this is, what they found, which was that that this particular diagram, you can see here that the lighter the color, the least vulnerable are they to displacement, and then the higher the more intense the yellow, the more vulnerable they are to displacement. And you'll see that they're basically doing it almost like block by block. It's not even really by zip codes, it's more by census tract. And they're looking at the percent of renters, which means, of course, they are more likely displacement because they can't stay. And they're also looking at the percent of the population that has less than high school degree. And then what they did is they developed a metric. So a scoring metric from most vulnerable to least vulnerable. So they looked at the median household income, the percent of renters, and the percent of the population. And that is how they developed this graphic. Here's an example of another tool. This is one of the federal tools that I'm worried it might disappear, but it's a really useful one. It's called the Climate and Economic Justice Screening Tool. And there's a lot more information in here than just things that are useful for climate. So I picked a part of Pittsburgh that I know is economically challenged in this area. But you can do this, you can just type in basically a zip code of any kind, a street location, and it will give, this information. So this, for example, is race and ethnicity. And then it will tell you like all these climate related things in terms of agriculture loss, building, population loss, flood risk, wildfire. And you'll see here for low income, so that where the income is less than or equal to twice the federal poverty level. So it's a 94th percentile. And then there's health issues like asthma, diabetes, and heart disease, and also things like energy cost. And I think that the reason I was not surprised about particulate matter, because this is an area where there used to be a lot of steel mills. And so there's still a lot of particulate matter in the air. I think the energy costs are high because a lot of the Pittsburgh older housing was built poorly without any insulation. And in Pittsburgh, sometimes we have very cold winters. And so that's, I think, probably why their energy costs are high. Now, one thing interesting in this is that they did not include race when they developed this tool, because they just basically made it as an assumption that it was already part of the data that was there, kind of underlying that information. But I like to mention this because you would expect it to be there, and it's like not there. So here's another one that I really like. So in case you are not aware of it, there's a lot of challenges with FEMA's flood insurance system and that data. So an organization, a nonprofit called First Street, has developed something where you can, again, type in a specific address. Like I could put in the address of my house, for example, and it will tell you what your risk is from various climate activities. So this, again, I'm just doing Pittsburgh as an example. So Pittsburgh has moderate risk from heat, and you can see based on all these little dots and things like that, that this is, again, it's not just like all of Pittsburgh, but it's getting down to specific census tracts, specific areas. And so this means you can do a lot of equity analysis, just like the neighborhood I showed you in the previous one. And this is also sort of like flooding. So, Pittsburgh is kind of famous because it has three rivers. But what's interesting to me is that even beyond, you can sort of see the three rivers aspect of it. They even have, by the way, have a place here called the bathtub, where a freeway totally like floods, like, I don't know, once or twice a year, which I found baffling when I moved here. I've been here about over 10 years. But you'll see here that there's also flooding in these outer areas. So to give an example, like I live in one of these outer suburbs of Pittsburgh, but because of a flash flooding incident, we actually had a woman who died just like about a mile or so from my house because of a flooding incident. So this is, as we have more climate change, that means more intense rain conditions, which means more flooding and more flood. And pretty much every state in the United States, I did an article about this, so I know I'm big on looking at flooding. is going to have more flooding due to climate change. And we're already seeing it now, and it's just going to get worse. So it's a really important thing to understand. And that goes back to that Chicago thing I said at the beginning. So here's another one. I just wanted to let you know that some states or planning authorities have these things. This one I just picked out. This is from New Jersey, and they said it was based on one that was in Delaware. And you'll see here, again, they have all sorts of useful data. Like, for example, the zero vehicle households. That's something that I was looking at in West Virginia because, again, people can't, there's less than, only about half of the counties in West Virginia have any sort of public transit access. So when you don't have a vehicle and there's no public transit that's even an option, it can be a real challenge to get to medical facilities. So I wanted to make sure you look in your state to see maybe there are some things that you haven't thought about. I just typed in, like Google, I just typed in equity analysis data. And like this one came up, for example. Here's another good place to look. This is called data.gov. Again, this is something that may or may not survive into the next administration. But here's the city of Austin, and it has these equity analysis zones. So don't, like data is, a really important factor in these things. So don't assume there is no data. You might be surprised. And then sometimes, like, again, even if you're working on health issues, the environmental data might also be as useful for you as any other sort of data. And lots of times it comes with GIS components with it, so you can download it. So like I have students who know how to do GIS stuff, and they can really give us some really useful maps when we're looking at some particular societal challenge. So the next thing is to do a systems analysis of the root causes of the inequities. And so now we're getting to the point where we're not just doing analysis, but we're of like the degree of inequity, but we're also trying to figure out how to solve those challenges. And this is an example of a systems perspective and sort of the kind of questions that you could ask an advisory committee and have some, really fruitful discussions. For example, what is unfair, unjust, and for whom on whatever the topic is you're working on? What are the root causes, the violation of rights, the harmful narratives? What's happening there? What are systems and levers of change that can impact the root causes? Who has the power to push and pull the levers? Where does the power need to be shifted? So you can start out in the sort of planning stage and then go through design, implementation, reflecting, and you can, by taking the systems perspective, you can really get a good understanding of what are the possible options. Now, I did this again with this West Virginia study. We did a systems diagram and analysis using those 4 E's I was talking about earlier: effectiveness, efficiency, equity, and ease of political acceptability. And then we asked people to take the next step, which is to sort of prioritize them. Basically, try to identify things that were low-hanging fruit, things that were harder to implement, easy to implement. And we did this through surveys and discussions that we had at events to gather information. So I'm suggesting you do this for the advisor group, and because like in our case, we had an advisor group, they developed a draft, but then we were testing that draft, testing those ideas with a much larger population than that was on the advisory group. Here's an example of a systems lens for a school activity. And you'll see here where it's like the symptom is that Black and Latino third graders are not as proficient in reading and math. They're looking at the trends, saying that the teachers that serve these are not certified compared to teachers and programs with majority issues. Then going to these other systems issues and looking at some of the sort of the mental models. So basically the mental model in this case is that policymakers know that students need a teacher, but they don't think it matters whether or not teachers are certified or not. but the data in this case indicate that it does matter if teachers are certified. Okay, so the next thing is to look at a equity impact assessment for policies and decisions. I'm going to go back to this sort of Denver example. And so the plan of action was to provide for sale affordable units, like apartment units. And so what the goal would be to increase let me see, reduce the number of people who rent in these communities that have high vulnerability to displacement. So there's more people who own homes in this area. And you can see here that this is a map where they're looking at the degree to which they have more or less access to housing. This is an example of a engagement plan that they developed for these particular neighborhoods in Denver, and sort of the goals and the different aspects. But I thought you'd like to maybe see what one of these things was like, and that there's more information if you go to the sort of the link on this. And then this is like each of the different groups that they thought was important to be engaged, and then how to reach each one of them. And you can see that it's all sorts of different kinds of organizations that we're talking about. So like everything from Spanish language media to YMCA rec groups, religious groups, senior apartments, veterans homes, apartment managers, affordable housing, all sorts of different people that were part of the engagement. So the last step is continuously evaluating the effectiveness and adapting the strategies in response to community engagement. So Denver developed this social equity program to help people purchase homes, sort of as I mentioned earlier. And so what they did is they provide up to $25,000 toward the purchase of a home for residents or direct descendants of residents who were in historically rent-lined areas. Looking at this time period from 38 to 2000, and of those 117 closing homes, and they got 2.7, and most of them were a million. And most of them were first-time home buyers. So the last thing I'm going to end with in my sprint to finish this is that equity analysis, as I sort of mentioned, is not easy. It's very important to do. It's very important to have a baseline. It's very important to have a goal, have a method that you follow. But it can definitely be challenging. This is a very useful set of documents. This is from the Kellogg Foundation. I'm not going to have time to go through all of these, but I want to make sure that you're sort of aware that they exist. And again, the link is here at the bottom, and you are going to get a copy of these slides. And you'll see here that it's again, even though they're on racial equity, they can really apply for any sort of equity that you are doing. So for example, the first one is like conducting evaluation, engaging communities is the second one there. Thinking about how evaluations are done. And within this, they have some sort of guidance. So, basically it says no matter how well intentioned or committed to racial equity you think you are, it helps to become accountable. And know when to act as a bridge builder, activist, or disruptor, correct misperceptions. It's important to be courageous because sometimes you do have to express, based on the data, unpopular views. It's this kind of speaking truth to power thing, which can make things challenging sometimes. And you always want to be curious. So the best thing you can do when somebody talks to you and the position is not something with which you agree or you think the data agrees is to ask why, to instead of confronting, be curious, because what we sometimes find, and I say this as an engineer and a scientist who loves data, but we all know that data does not have all the answers, and we never have perfect data. And sometimes these lived experiences are more important as an input than quantitative data that we have. The other thing that they talk about is how to be prepared for tension and conflict. And that goes back to that preliminary research to really kind of understanding, what are the things that you really, you're not going to find it in any research paper or book. Really trying to understand what the different perspectives are, why people have those perspectives, and remain very neutral in the discussion. And then they have these sort of tips, right? So this is, I have to include community voices in the evaluation process, but the funder has a short time frame and a small budget. There's no way I can do everything. How do I approach the problem? And part of it is sometimes, and they have several solutions. I just picked this one, which is explaining why time to get to know the community matters. And I will say that is very important. That's something that I've had to often do. I think people sort of understand it if you relate it to things like, like you don't like buy something on Amazon without looking at the reviews, right? So there's much more of that community engagement, and people have much higher expectations of their level of involvement. Then this is the one that I've had the most difficulty with, and I've talked to a number of people, and the answer that they give is the answer I've been given when I talk to community activists, is I've reached out to community leaders who are supposed to contact as part of the evaluation, but I haven't heard from them. I don't have relationships with these leaders, but if I tell them it's part of the evaluation to build community capacity, build include infrastructure, why am I not hearing back? And the answer is because a lot of these community leaders are they're volunteers. That's the most important thing. So they don't have a lot of time. They got full-time jobs, families, and everything else. And also because sometimes they're overburdened with people asking them, what it is that they think. Just like I don't know about you, but I would say probably I get 5 to 10 emails every day asking me to evaluate something, right? A product, a service, whatever it might be. So the key is that it not be a one-time interaction, that you start building that relationship early. And uh, when you're talking to people, interviewing them, things of that nature, that you do it early. And that's another reason why it's really important to have community engagement throughout the process. It's also why it's important to have an advisory committee, because even if the community leader doesn't know you, maybe they know the advisory committee member, and that advisory committee member can help you reach those individuals. So I would say this is, to me, one of the biggest challenges in doing equity analysis, is not getting a response from the community that you'd really like to hear from. And like I said, I hear it over again, come to our quarterly meetings, our monthly meetings, before you start asking us to do something for you. Develop a relationship with whatever that group is. Okay, so that is the end. I am pretty much on time. This is my book. This is which just came out in April of this year. It's called From Expertise to Impact, and it basically goes through the entire policy analysis process. It has one chapter that is about equity and gives an example of an equity. I have one example that I go through all of this. I will put again in the chat how you can get a free copy of it. So anybody who goes to one of my workshops can get a free copy. If you say, hey, I love this book, it's wonderful, I want a real version of it, you can actually go to Amazon. It's only $10. I try to keep as low as possible for a Kindle version. And with that, my presentation is at an end, and I'm happy to answer any questions that have come up in the meantime.
Thank you very much, Deborah.